Okay, welcome. So here we are at another video. We're going to continue along in the Messianic Seal. The last time we covered a lot of material with regard to the Essenes and the possibility, fascinating, I think, of the idea that the Messiah, potentially in the upper room experience, was over the throne of David in the Essene quarter. So let's continue on. There's some other things in there too. I think we ended with number 19 before. We're going to continue on with page 20. Okay, and it was here also that an edict was given under the authority of James and Peter that allowed uncircumcised Gentiles into the body of believers subject to the moral laws of Noah. I don't know if I agree with that there. I don't think that's correct. Because if you look at Acts 15:21, let's go to Acts 15:21. Okay, here it is. Wherefore I decide, this is 19, I decide not to be harassing those from the nations who are turning back to Yahuwah, but to write an epistle to them to be abstaining from ceremonial pollution, from idols and prostitution and what is strangled and blood. For Moses from ancient generations, city by city, has those who are heralding him being read on every Sabbath in the synagogues. Well, what the ruling was is that you can get them in the gate as long as they abide by these four things right here: abstaining from ceremonial pollutions, from idols, prostitution, what is strangled, and blood. Okay, you get them into the gate, those four things, and then what is the expectation? That they're going to go to the synagogues with the rest of the Nazarenes, and they're going to learn the rest. So I just wanted to make that point here, that I don't agree with the author on this part, subject to the moral laws of Noah. James the Just was the first bishop of the Jerusalem church after he was murdered by the Sadducean high priest Simeon, son of Cleopas, of the line of David and cousin to Yahushua and James, was instated in his stead. After this, a line of bishops from the family of Yahushua became the official guardians of the throne of David. Okay, so James the Just was the first one. He was murdered by a Sadducean high priest. Then you have Simeon, son of Cleopas. He was the successor. And then a line of bishops from the family of Yahushua became the official guardians of the throne of David. This familial succession to leadership of the early assemblies would not have been possible as such an important site in the strictly structured Essene quarter unless there were themselves highly regarded Essenes. I believe that these Nazarenes were the Essene champions of the long-awaited Messiah from the house of David. Interesting. Modern Catholic scholars would refute that these Nazarenes actually sat upon the throne of David. In his article in Biblical Archaeological Review, this is in 1990, Church of the Apostles, founded on Mount Zion, Bargel Pixter, the Catholic archaeologist and historian from Mount Zion, contends that the traditional tomb of David is not the genuine location. In the third paragraph of his article, he states that, quote, okay, so we'll get to that, what he states there. Let's look at these notes first. Let's see, this was after a dispute in Antioch 20 years after the crucifixion between Paul and a delegation sent from James over the eligibility of uncircumcised converts. Okay, yeah, so this has to do with this dispute in Acts, Galatians 2:12 through 13. Before the coming of some from James, he ate together with those of the nations. Yet, this is speaking of Peter, but Paul withstands him to his face. And yet, when he came, he shrank back and severed himself, fearing those of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that Barnabas also was led astray with their hypocrisies. Okay, so this is Paul standing up for the Gentile believers who were admitted into the assembly as long as they adhere to those four things. If this dispute came up only after 20 years, then at this time the church synagogue consisted exclusively of Jewish Nazarenes. That would make sense. In Hegesippus' memoirs, quoted by Eusebius, it is recorded that James was set upon the pinnacle of the temple, the very pinnacle upon which Yeshua was tempted of Satan by the Sadducean high priest, Joseph, and asked, "Who is the door?" To which he answered, "He sits on the right of the supreme power." At this, he was thrown down from the temple wall. Hegesippus, quoted by Eusebius. Okay, this is Ecclesiastical Histories, Book 2, Chapter 23 to 12. Okay, so this is how James the Just died. He was thrown off the pinnacle of the temple because he would not deny the Master Yahushua and said that he sits upon the right of the supreme power. For this evil, the high priest was taken from Joseph, who was very insolent and very rigid in judging offenders, by King Agrippa after a demonstration by the most equitable of the citizens. So I guess the more thought, the people who were well thought of, really very upset because James the Just, I seem to recall reading elsewhere, he was do a lot of praying. He would, in the temple courts, praying and advocating for the nation. And people loved him. In this rendition, Josephus claims that James was stoned. Okay, so this is Josephus. Another legend has it that James was thrown down the famous temple steps and beaten to death with a fuller's club. Okay. Josephus, this is my personal viewpoint. I don't think he was correct here, because I think he was trying to hide some of the more grievous offenses that his own nation perpetrated against Kadosh men, because he was writing on behalf of the Romans, and he wanted to ameliorate some of the most grievous offenses. And so this is the thing with Josephus you have to be careful of when you look at Antiquities, the War of the Jews. Another legend has it that James was thrown down the famous temple steps, beaten to death with a fuller's club. Okay. The tomb of David was certainly in need of continuous guard. The Maccabean high priest and hero John Hyrcanus had, with no respect for David or his royal line, looted the sumptuous ancient tomb of its treasures to pay tribute to Antiochus the Pious in order to stop his siege on the city. Oh my goodness. It is here implied by Josephus that from this tomb of the richest of all kings, I thought Solomon might have been that, Hyrcanus had money enough that, relying on his wealth, maintained foreign troops, Antiquities, for wars. Later, King Herod would also attempt to rob the tomb, translated from Hebrew as shoots or sprouts from the stump of Jesse. Notri is still used in modern Hebrew as the word for Christian. Okay, but sadly, a lot of the Christians have not realized the Davidic line connection and the connection to, even beyond that, to Torah that the early Nazarenes had. Okay, so let's go back up here where we see this. This is this Bargel Pixner. He's a Catholic archaeologist. He's disputing this idea about the throne of David. Obviously, the Catholic Church has a vested interest in claiming that their authority springs from Rome. So they wouldn't want anybody's attention focused on Mount Zion, of course. They want everybody focused on Rome, where they claim that Peter, that was his initial seat. So let's see what this guy says here. He says, quotes, is not really disputed by any serious body of scholarship. That is, that the structure in which the traditional tomb of David is located on Mount Zion is really a Roman period synagogue and not the tomb of David. See that? Of course, what would be the thing to do on a tomb? You'd want to put a synagogue around it to protect it. Obviously, I'm biased to believe that this was the tomb of David. Because it fits with other prophecies too, relative to the Catholic Church's anti-Torah stances and anything that they can do to hide anything relative to any foundational or principal places being in Mount Zion. Let's see. He goes on to inform us that the original Mount Zion and the tombs of the Davidic royal line are probably to be found on the lower eastern hill of the city of David. Pixter does admit, though, indeed, that Zion has been something of a movable mountain, as has David's tomb. He also admits that though the muddling of time and destruction of the city no one really knows anymore, he informs us that the last person we know of who knew the exact location of David's tomb was Rabbi Akiva. The revered rabbi of Second Judean Revolt fame, Rabbi Akiva proclaimed Bar Kokhba, King Messiah. Remember, after Messiah was murdered on a cross at the behest of the Jewish authorities, because they wanted to turn him over to the Romans. They wanted to get rid of him because he was challenging their entire religious makeup. And all of that happened, and we know the Messiah rose again on the third day, and he sits at the right hand of the Father. James the Just was killed for believing that. And even still, after that happened, all the miracles on Yom Kippur stopped, according to Flavius Josephus. The Jews still stiff-neckedly decided, we're just going to carry on. Regardless of no miracles happening, regardless if all of this that happened with Yahushua happened, that they took part in. And so then they wanted to crown another guy and revolt again against Rome and do it with the armor of flesh. Of course, that failed miserably. I think the Romans tortured Rabbi Akiva, this Bar Kokhba guy. They tortured him. They may have tortured Rabbi Akiva too. I think he died pretty badly because they would not listen to the prophet that was sent to them. They didn't know the time of their visitation, as Messiah said. Anyway. So he's the guy that did this, this Bar Kokhba. That literally means son of the star. That bar word is not Hebrew, it's Aramaic. We're learning about that in our Aramaic studies. I've got one video on there, but we're actually a lot further ahead. I wanted to get through the whole book before we did any videos on it. Anyway, I can see that there is possibility that David's tomb was originally on the lower hill, yet there's just fell reason to believe otherwise. For one, Josephus, who lived while the temple and other Jerusalem monuments yet stood and had an intimate knowledge of the layouts of the city, placed Zion on the western traditional hill. If Zion was originally to be found upon the eastern hill, then the first century occupants of the city did not know of this fact. Yet there is more compelling evidence to support the traditional contention that Zion and David's tomb were to be found upon the higher western hill. Even if the eastern hill was the original location, the first century Nazarenes believed it to be on the western and traditional site. In the second chapter of Acts, we find a straightforward statement that on the first Pentecost, the Paraclete descended in tongues of fire at our site, and it was in this place that Peter gave his famous Pentecost sermon, or Shavuot sermon. I believe that this sermon and the whole of Acts chapters 1 and 2 are in part a clear testimony that proclaims the existence and the purpose of the planting of the original Nazarene base on the top of Mount Zion. The witness Luke informs us that these were all of one tribe of men, Galileans from the Nazarene enclave based upon Damascus and not Jerusalem. Acts 1:15 tells us that the original kahal, or assembly, numbered about 120 adherents. Let's look that up. Acts 1:15. Okay, in those days, Peter, rising in the midst of the brethren, besides there was a throng in the same place of about 120 names, said, okay, and tells us the original, so all of these were Galilean Nazarenes. It is obvious that this Essene sect was formed of those who followed the legacy of the house of David, and all were amazed and marveled, saying to one another, behold, are not all of these those speaking Galileans? Acts 2-7. Okay, Acts 2:7. Okay, Now, when this sound occurs, the multitude came together, was confused, for each one hears them speaking in his own vernacular. Now they are all amazed and marveled. Lo, are these not all who are speaking Galilean? So this is a tongues of fire episode where they were speaking in other languages. In Acts chapter, is it 2, I think, yeah. Okay, it's obvious that they've seen, okay, behold, are all these speaking Galileans. Peter opened his sermon by showing the words of the Ruach HaKodesh being spoken by David, Acts 1:16, and then he quotes the Psalms of David. Let's look at Acts 1:16. Okay, men, brethren, fulfilled must be the scripture in which the Ruach HaKodesh said before through the mouth of David concerning Judas, who became the guide of those apprehending Yahushua. Okay. Okay, and then he quotes the Psalms of David in, okay, so there's a Josephus Wars, Books 5, Chapter 4. What is this, 37? Let's see what that's in regard to. There it is right here. Knowledge of the layout of the city, place sign on the western traditional hill. That's according to Josephus, Book of the Wars. Wars of the Jews, Book 5, Chapter 4. Okay, so also the sermon we're talking about now. In Acts 2:25-28, Peter introduces Yahushua as the expected one, quoted from the mouth of David. For David said as to him, I always foresaw Yahuwah, or the master before me, because he is at my right hand, that I am not to be moved. For this reason my heart rejoiced, and my tongue was glad, and my flesh also will dwell on hope, because you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you give your Holy One to see corruption. You revealed to me paths of life, and you will fill me with joy with your face. Okay, so this is quoting directly here too. Okay, so in Acts 2:29, Peter mentions David again, only this time he speaks of the tomb of David. Men, brothers, it is permitted to say to you which plainness as to the patriarch David, with plainness as to the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is among us until this day. This quote is from the Interlinear Bible, Henderson Publishers. Other translations put David's tomb variously at either with us or among us. The Greek word here translated is in. There are other common words besides en used in the Greek for both with and among. En is better translated as is, on, at, before, and within. Well, let's take a look at that. Acts 2:29. I've got the Greek right here. Okay. Let's see here. Men, brethren, allow me to say to you with boldness that he ceases also was a tomb, and his tomb is among us unto this day. There it is. In, among, by, with, on, at, and to. Okay, so there's other words apparently that can encapsulate these other ones. That's the point he's making. Okay, so in the concordant Greek text, which I believe the most liberal English translation from the Greek, Peter says thus, the memorial tomb of him is in us until the day this. Here it is obvious to me that Peter, after introducing Yahushua the Nazarene shoot as the anointed Messiah from the mouth of David, can point to the tomb administrated by the Nazarenes right there in that place. James the Just also proclaims the resurrection of the long-awaited tabernacle of David, which has fallen at this site. See Acts 15:15-7. Let's see Acts 15:15-7. 15-17, I think. And with this agree the words of the prophets, according as it is written, after these things I will turn back and I will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which has fallen and is overturned. Structure will I rebuild, and I will re-erect it. So those that left of mankind should be seeking out the Master and all the nations on them over whom my name is invoked. Interesting. Over whom my name is invoked, is saying the Master who is doing these things. Okay. Now there's an Amos one too here. Amos 9:11 through 12. All right, Amos 9. Okay, so this is in Amos. In that day shall I rise up the fallen booth of David, and I will dike up its breaches with stones. Isn't that interesting? With stones. That could be metaphorically ministers. And its demolished places shall I raise, and I will rebuild it as in the days of the eon. Interesting. Now this word eon, they're using olam. Let's see here. Right here, olam. All right. Eusebius writes in his Demonstratio Evangelica that this place was no other than Zion. This is the word of the gospel, which through our Master Yahushua Messiah and through the apostles went out from Zion and was spread to every nation. It is a fact that it poured forth from Yerushalayim, Mount Zion adjacent to it, on which our Savior and Master had stayed many times and where he had taught much doctrine. I believe that it is well documented that Zion indeed was known to be the Western Hill, and that even if not, our Nazarenes believed themselves to be occupying the true site. This whole argument then becomes demonstratively irrelevant to this study. Okay, so we really can't put a lot of stock. I mean, it's like asking the fox if he, if he took the hen or something, The Catholics have a massive vested interest in misleading people on stuff relative to Mount Zion. Let's just face it. I mean, their entire structure of authority is based in Rome. It's the papacy. And everything flows out from that of a worldly nature. All right. All right, so continuing, I believe that it is well documented that Zion indeed was known to be the Western Hill, and that even if not, our Nazarenes believe themselves to be occupying the true site. This whole argument then becomes demonstrably irrelevant to the study. What is entirely mind-boggling to me is the fact that none of the modern historians or scroll scholars have managed to unlock the meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In missing the Zadok connection, they simply miss the massive late Second Temple Zadokite explosion that it sparked, with all of its implications for later Judaism, Christianity, and world culture. Zadok is simply written all over the scrolls. Yet for modern scholars, the Sadducees are only Hellenized elites and not wicked priest usurpers of the profane temple as the Zadokites saw them. Okay. In other words, the idea is that even as it is today, when people look toward Rome, they look toward anti-Torah teachings, everything that is away from the commandments of Elohim, and because they have big letters next to their names, because they have money, because they have backing, because there's lots of people going to their assemblies, that is what the world looks at as greatness. They don't refine truth through the strict lens of the prophetic word with regard to provenance, with regard to origination of priesthood. And so this is why they're not really keen into the Zadok connection. That's what I'm getting from this. In the book James, the Brother of Yahushua by Robert Eisenman, I've actually seen this guy on video, Robert Eisenman. I've seen him literally in person. We were in Georgia at a time. I was with an Essene group. He's written a lot of interesting books, and he was involved in the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery group. The most authoritative volume which I have read on this subject, the author refers us to a quote from Josephus. There was now enkindled mutual enmity and class warfare between the high priest on the one hand and the priests and the leaders of the mass of Jerusalem on the other. Each of the factions formed and collected for itself a band of the most reckless innovators who acted as their leaders. And when they clashed, they used abusive language and pelted each other with stones. That sounds a little bit like some Orthodox quarters in Jerusalem, doesn't it? Where they're known to throw stones at people they don't like. And there was not even one person to rebuke them. Rightfully attributing this instance to the tumult and rioting during the time when James the Just was martyred, Eisenman presumes these priests of the masses had been lower priests. I would suggest that these priests of the masses would rather be the higher Essene priests, loyal to Zadok and the old-time religion, especially when we consider that the early Nazarene movement counted a great crowd of the priests among their recent converts. Okay, Acts 6:7. Interesting. Let's look at that. And the word of Yahuwah grows, and the number of the disciples in Jerusalem multiplied tremendously, besides a vast throng of priests obeyed the faith. Wow. You know, you read this stuff, but it's not until you get this information collated together that, you know, it starts, you start to have a narrative, you know, to fit together. So that's kind of neat there. A lot of priests joined them. Okay, Emmanuel Testa called these priestly groups similar to those of Qumran. It would stand to reason that for the Essenes who awaited both Messiahs, joining with those who awaited either one would be perfectly natural and, in fact, assured. It is easy to understand why Eisenman and others might miss the point for two reasons. The first reason is that since the fall of the temple, the role of Jewish priests had been drastically downgraded. The modern Kohen is a paper tiger with few responsibilities or privileges. Judaism has simply forgotten the all-important role played by the priests in Torah Judaism. For the lack of the priestly role in the commandments of the Torah, all Jews are now considered ritually unclean. When the priestly house of Zadok fell, so did the spiritual and physical trusteeship of the nation. Onias III, the last of the line of legitimate high priests, took his responsibility as father of the nation as a sacred trust. Besides overseeing the purity of the sacrifices and temple rituals and the correct administration of the law of Yahuwah, Onias was also the nation's banker. Interesting. Let's look at these notes. Robert Eisenman, also co-author of the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered and famous for co-authoring the facsimile edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is the director of the Institute of Middle East Religions and Archaeology's Judeo-Christian Origins at California State University, Long Beach. I think he's retired now, but at the time of this writing. Josephus Antiquities 20, quoted by Eisenman, James, the brother of Yahushua. Testa Emmanuel, the faith of the Mother Church. Also Bargol Pixner, Jerusalem's Essene Gateway. Okay, so these are all relative to those notes with regard to the Catholic guy that disputed. Okay, like other contemporary temples to the deities, some of those of Baal and Ishtar, the temple in Jerusalem contained the treasury of the nation. The temple treasury was considered inviolable. The financial and therefore the political stability of Judea and the whole Jewish world depended on this. If this sacred trust should be violated and the treasury looted, then all vestiges of sovereignty and independence of the Jewish nation would be in jeopardy. If the Jewish economy should be undermined, then all that would remain would be vassalship and slavery to pagan foreign powers. This was the spiritual and political weight that fell upon the shoulders of one righteous man. Onias guarded the deposits of the temple treasury with his life. In the end, he lost both. But Heliodorus, because of the orders he had from the king Epiphanes, said that this money must in any case be confiscated for the king's treasury. So he set a day and went to direct the inspection of these funds. There was no little distress throughout the whole city. The priests prostrated themselves before the altar in their priestly vestments and called toward heaven upon him who had given the Torah about deposits, that he should keep them safe for those who had deposited them. To see the appearance of the high priest was to be wounded at the heart, for his face and the change in his color disclosed the anguish of his soul, for terror and bodily trembling that came over the man, which plainly showed that those who looked at him, the pain lodged in his heart. People also hurried out of their houses in crowds to make a general supplication, because the holy place was about to be brought into dishonor. Women girded with sackcloth under their breasts thronged the streets. Some of the young women who were kept indoors ran together to the gates, and some to the walls. Others peered out the windows, and holding up their hands to heaven, they all made supplication. There was something pitiable in the prostration of the whole populace and the anxiety of the high priest in his great anguish. The second and main reason the scholars might miss the Zadok connection is that Josephus, our chief source for this period, I believe purposefully buried Zadok by omission. I guessed that even before he said it. He has an axe to grind. It is well known among scholars that Josephus, although he praises his own truthfulness, yet gives biased renditions discoverable from other sources. And Josephus had much reason to be biased. He wrote under the lustrous condition of empirical sanction and sanctuary. A turncoat Jewish general of the Galilee during the revolt, he rode in with Titus and watched the temple. Okay, let's we'll do this last sentence again, and then we'll move on. But let's look at these notes. The virgin daughters of Zion, 41. There we go. Virgin daughters of Zion, 2 Maccabees 3, 13 through 21. That's where this is recounted about Epiphanes wanting to loot the treasury. Josephus held command over Essene territory. Okay, interesting. Okay, so a turncoat general, this is Flavius Josephus of the Galilee during the revolt. He rode in with Titus and watched the temple burn. Politically, Josephus was forced to turn toward Rome with his back toward those heroes of the revolt. He was afterward hated by his countrymen. So he had to really, here he was. He had to really, he had to be careful in what he said with regard to the Jews on the one hand, but on the other hand, he had the Romans. So he was in a strait betwixt two. And so this is why we have to take his writings with a grain of salt sometimes, especially if it's relative to Zadok. Josephus would bring these zealot heroes of Masada who finished their lives, man, woman, child, down to the nasty little daggermen stabbers running amok in the temple courtyards. He simply could not stand on the side of those fellow countrymen and patriots who so stiff-neckedly and violently opposed his patron, Rome. The zealots were among the leaders of the opposition to the Sadducean priesthood. Josephus documents them with disgust, yet he had an even weightier reason to bury Zadok. Josephus was a priest and prince of the Hasmonean royal court. He was politically family related through his mother to the Maccabean usurpers of the high priesthood. Although he praises the virtues of the Essenes, he never lets you know about their principal concerns. To Josephus, Zadok was opposite and opposing to his own royal house. Well, that would make sense. Remember, a bunch of those Zadok priests took off as soon as the Hasmoneans decided to put their own king, who had no Davidic connection, and put their own high priest that had no Zadok connection. His own claim to royalty and exalted status before Rome, in fact, depended upon Zadok's dismissal. Josephus, who recorded even trivial, meticulous details in his exhaustive works, could never have missed the important and legendary reign of the house of Zadok. Zadok, the ancestor, had carried the Ark of the Covenant through the countryside with David in the latter's travails. He had also carried the ark into its permanent resting place beyond the veil and the first temple of Solomon. His family reigned with few interruptions through both temple periods up until Antiochus IV Epiphanes and the denouncement of Onias III. Okay, so remember Onias III being the last of the Zadok line. He ended up dying, trying to defend the treasury. Josephus has much praise for the Maccabees, yet passes over Zadok with a silent whisper. When informing us of the fall of the Zadokite dynasty, he passively states, and driving away the sons of Onias III, put Jasimus into the high priest place. And one that was indeed of the stock of Aaron, but not of the family of Onias. Okay, so there's some other priestly line, but not of Zadok. No clue here. When speaking of the rival temple in Leontopolis, Egypt, Josephus informs us that Onias asked permission of Ptolemy and Cleopatra that, okay, let's look at these notes here, and then we'll reread this. Even the Pharisees had demanded the Hasmoneans must step down from the high priesthood, okay? The ruling Sadducean high priesthood stood loyal to Rome until the bitter end, even to the point of recording the biting off of the ears of a contender to the high priesthood, therefore rendered him blemished and unfit for office. Wow. What's that, 46? Let's look at that, 46. Okay, Josephus and his exhaustive. Okay, this is something that they are talking about, how there was this mad rush to see who was going to get placed, and the people who were supposed to be placed got knocked out of the contender. Got knocked out of the contending. The Zadok, this Onias, or the sons of Onias, were the ones who should have been placed as high priests, but they weren't. They were overruled by these Hasmonean guys. Josephus has a big interest in keeping his family legacy intact without ill repute. But the story of Onias and the Zadokites certainly cast a good amount of disrepute upon Flavius Josephus and these Hasmonean connections. And I can see why, in reading these connections, I can almost see why people they don't really want to keep Hanukkah because of this whole thing. And I can, it gives me some, I guess, more insight as to why, perhaps, even if they don't even realize why. I think a lot of them don't even realize why. They just go along, with whoever their teacher is. But maybe the teacher does. All right, so when speaking of the rival temple in Leontopolis, Egypt, Josephus informs us that Onias asked permission of Ptolemy and Cleopatra that he might build a temple in Egypt like that at Jerusalem and might ordain Levites and priests out of their own stock. Okay, so he wanted, remember the story about how they allowed that temple to stand in Egypt? And they were all Zadokites. And they even set up their own altar and whatnot. These statements prove that it is possible to tell the truth and hold it back at the same time. Still no clue to the important hierarchy of Zadok or to the usurpation. Josephus would have us believe that the transition from the house of Zadok to his own Maccabean line went normally and peacefully. The scrolls tell another story. Okay. The Essenes, that's interesting. You never get the truth until you have both sides. Both sides, the truth is in the middle, after you hear both sides. The Essenes therefore awaited only the Messiah of Aaron, the teacher of righteousness and son of Zadok, under the banner of Melchizedek, this priestly Messiah. Now that's interesting. Look at that. Because look at the argument that Hebrews makes regarding Melchizedek, and he connects it to Messiah Yahushua. This priestly Messiah would leave the heavenly armies and join the battle of the sons of light against the sons of darkness of the war scroll. The returned Messiah of David would also take part in this scenario. In this forthcoming battle, Belial, Satan, and his demonic armies, the Kittim, Romans at that time, but also Kittim could refer to any usurper or violent occupier, and all the sons of darkness would be defeated. The polluted temple would be destroyed and a new Jerusalem with a new pure temple would come down from heaven. Wow, doesn't that look like Revelation? And a new Jerusalem with a new pure temple would come down from heaven. The Messiahs of Aaron and David would then take their rightful chairs and the kingdom age would begin. That's the Atid Labo, the millennial age, I believe is what they're speaking of. This was not to be. In 70 CE, Titus and his Roman legions swept down on Jerusalem and destroyed the magnificent temple of Herod. When the conflagration had ended and the rivers of blood dried black on the marble paving stones, not one stone was left upon another of what had been the temple of Yahuwah. Remember Yahushua prophesied that, said to them, not one stone will be left on another. Okay, Qumran had been destroyed a few years earlier with its treasured library of scrolls undiscovered and hidden for nearly 2,000 years. Evidently, there remained alive not one of the residents of Qumran who knew the whereabouts of the hidden scrolls. Some Qumranites probably fled to the nearby mountain fortress of Masada and met their end there. In 73 CE, along with the Zealots, themselves a militarily active subgroup of the Essenes. Okay. Okay, so here's the notes. A lot of these are in antiquities. Josephus, like we, could not have known of the hidden Qumran scrolls, okay? Legend has it that the plunderers of the temple period pried loose the remaining foundation stones in order to recover the gold and precious metals turned to glowing liquid by the conflagration, which found the lowest points of gravity between the seams. Okay, this is why no stone was left on another, because all the gold melted down into the cracks between the stones. The Romans wanted that gold so badly, they just tore the place up, according to even Messiah's prophecy. The Zealots continued the revolt among the large Jewish community in Egypt. Initially meeting with success, the revolt was eventually squashed by Rome. Okay, so that's probably why they didn't last very long, even after Messiah. The ones who carried on in Egypt. Fragments of Qumranite sectarian scrolls were found among the ruins by Yigal Yadin. Okay, interesting. Now this is interesting, these books. I often wonder if this entire story of, here you have Flavius Josephus, he's part of the Maccabean family, he's trying to assure his legacy in his writing. He's got he's vested self-interest in that, and he doesn't want to talk about the Zadok. He doesn't want to talk about all the violence that was done to them and the Hasmoneans facilitated to the Zadok line. It's interesting that these books got buried for 2,000 years. They came out in this century. It reminds me of that prophecy, kind of, in Daniel. Have you ever read that? So that prophecy is in the book of Daniel, chapter 12. And in that era, Michael shall stand up, the great chief who is standing over the sons of your people. Then an era of distress will come to pass, such has not occurred since there was a nation on the earth till that era. Now, in that era, your people will escape all those found written in the scroll. For those sleeping in the soil of the ground, many shall awake. Those to Enian life, that would be like eternal life, and those to reproach for Enian repulsion. In other words, let's see here. Yeah, olam means continuously, like leolam by ad, continuously. The intelligent shall warn as though warning of the atmosphere, and those turning many to the righteousness will be as stars of that eon and further. Now you, Daniel, stop up the words and seal the scroll until the era of the end, when many shall swerve as evil shall increase. Okay, so now I think in the King James it interprets this as many shall run to and fro. Now this says evil, but they're interpreting it as knowledge. The knowledge right there, hada'at, the knowledge, that's what it is. as knowledge shall increase. Knowledge isn't necessarily looked upon as bad, although, and when you read the book of Enoch, there's some knowledge that the fallen angels taught mankind was very bad. But the idea is that the Almighty plans to allow certain knowledge in this end period. And I just kind of think it's interesting that the Dead Sea Scrolls could very well be a fulfillment of a part of that, at least, you know. Okay, let me see here. Okay, he might build up a temple in Egypt like that at Jerusalem, and might ordain Levites and priests out of their own stock. Okay, so we already read this. Messiahs of Aaron, okay. Say this was not to be. In other words, they were really trying to bring righteousness, but the Messiah said, you know, and also the prophecy said that Jerusalem is going to have to fall. The temple is going to have to be destroyed. They destroyed the magnificent temple of Herod and they not one stone was left on another. Qumran had been discovered a few years early with its treasured library of scrolls undiscovered and hidden for nearly 2,000 years. Evidently, there remained alive not one of the residents of Qumran. Some Qumranites probably fled to the nearby mountain forest of Masada and met their end there in 73 CE, along with the Zealots themselves, a military active subgroup of the Essenes. Okay, so let's go down. I think this is where we need to start at. The Messiah of Aaron had not come. The force of darkness had prevailed in a then-time Armageddon. There was no New Jerusalem and no kingdom, only drawn faces, torn black sackcloth, and dust remained. The Nazarenes, following Yahushua's instruction, had fled Zion to the hills of Judea, actually Pella in Transjordan. Remember, now according to Flavius Josephus, when the armies were surrounding, the Nazarenes, there was some kind of a message given to Titus, and he pulled his troops back. He thought there was revolt in Egypt. He's going to pull his troops back for a while. That gave an opportunity. Well, the Jews just holed up. They figured, well, we're just going to stay here because surely he's going to be back. We're not going to trust this. No way, no how. But the Nazarenes remember the words of Yahushua, and so they took the opportunity to get out of Dodge, and they went to Pella, and that's how they were saved, because Titus came right back with his army and realized it wasn't that big of a deal. And then also that really set the Jews on edge, because they did not believe anything Yahushua said, but the Nazarenes took the words of Yahushua as gospel, as we do, and they got out before destruction came. And then what made the Nazarenes even worse of a black spot in the eyes of the Jews was that they refused to join the Bar Kokhba revolt. They already knew that it was going to fail, because Yahushua, the Messiah, had already come and been crucified and rose again on the third day. Anyway, so yes, they get out of there. The Nazarenes, following Yahushua's instructions, had fled Zion to the hills of Judea, actually Pella and Transjordan, but they soon returned to their custodianship of the upper room of the tomb of David. There, a hierarchy of heredity from the family of Yahushua guarded the throne of David until 135 CE. Isn't that something? In that year, Bar Kokhba was defeated, and Hadrian converted the city of Jerusalem into the pagan Aelia Capitolina, forbidding Jews from residing in the city. Now, interesting. This is a little extra thing here. I often thought it was Titus that converted, but that came a little after that. And when Bar Kokhba was defeated, they renamed it. And the Jews were thrown out. They were only allowed to come a certain distance to lament the city once a year. I think I read that somewhere, Flavius Josephus. So what of the Messiah of Aaron? The Nazarenes continued to occupy the cenacle on Zion for 65 years after the fall of the temple. Why had their hopes not been dashed when the priestly Messiah had failed to appear? Why did they not break up in defeat and go home as the disciples had after the crucifixion? The Essenes understood from what had been written of the kingdom age by the prophet Zechariah that there were to be two Messiahs. And I answered and said unto them, where are these two olive trees? What are the two clusters of olives which are beside the two golden pipes, emptying the golden oil from themselves? And he said, these are the two sons of fresh oil who stand by the master of the whole earth. Isn't that interesting? Zechariah 4, 11, 12, and 14. Zechariah. Then I answered and said, what are these two olive trees on the right side of the lampstand on the left? Well, this is actually using etzim. That's a team, or it comes from etz, tree. And I answered a second time, said, what are the two olive limbs which by means of the two golden conduits are emptying the golden oil from above them? Okay. He's got an interesting translation there, doesn't he? Shatai, Shabli, limbs. And there still is etzim is in there. That's tree. Conduits. I don't see anything about sons or men. I don't know about that. What was that other one he mentioned? 11, 12, and 14. All right. Let's look at 14. He said, these are the two, oh, there we go. That's what he's talking about. These are the two sons of clarified oil who are standing by the master of the entire earth. Okay, so there it is. Benai. Well. Okay. Okay, that's something. So then maybe that does refer to, that's an interesting interpretation of that, because we've often interpreted that in another way. Although when I look at interpretations, I use the parties interpretation model, where you have the literal, the pashat, and you have something that's hinting to something beyond the literal. This is the remez. You have the allegorical, the drash, and then you have this stuff that's way up there, mystical, sod. That's interesting, but that's an interesting interpretation he's got here. So it could be that these are the two messiahs, what he's talking about. The one, the Messiah ben Yosef, which they kind of think of as Yahushua, or at least the Nazarenes accept. And then also Messiah ben David, he's the same guy, comes back second time, destroys the adversaries, and inaugurates the millennial reign. Although the manual of discipline speaks of the coming of a prophet and the anointed ones, Meshiki, plural of Aaron and Israel, the Damascus document, on the other hand, hints that these two might come as one, the Messiah singular of Aaron and Israel. That's what it seems to imply. As previously mentioned, the Essenes had cast their martyred teacher of righteousness in a new role on his expected return, the priesthood of Melchizedek. Thus, he would return in a new heavenly priestly line, and it will be proclaimed. Now, this is exactly how the book of Hebrews casts Yahushua, okay? And it will be proclaimed at the end of the days concerning the captives, as he said, to proclaim liberty to the captives, Isaiah 61:1. Let's look at that. Where's Isaiah? All right, 61:1. All right, the spirit of my Yahuwah is on me, because Yahuwah anoints me to bear tidings to the humble. He sends me to bind up the broken of heart, to herald the captives, liberty into the sightless, and closed eyes into the bound, emancipation. All right, so this is the renewed covenant scripture seems to say that this is Yahushua who's doing this. Okay. Its interpretation is that he will assign them to the sons of heaven, to the inheritance of Melchizedek, or he will cast their lot amid the portions of Melchizedek, who will return them there and will proclaim to them liberty, forgiving them the wrongdoings of all their iniquities. Okay, I think we're going to stop here, but let's look at these notes. Even after 135 CE, the Nazarenes made secret pilgrimages to the site and in fact reestablished a weak presence there. This is borne out in many of the Essene books, such as the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. Okay, interesting. Here's Qumran scrolls, Hebrew, King of Righteousness. This is the passage in which Yahushua refers to himself as the Spirit of Yahuwah is upon me. So Yahushua is identifying himself in that synagogue when he was reading from Isaiah. Wow, there's just a lot that these Essenes, there just seems to be a lot that these Essenes, their teaching just has a lot of intersecting elements with what the renewed covenant scriptures, Matthew to Revelation. And I tell you what, this has been a very enjoyable study for me. If you guys enjoyed it as well, throw a comment down, send me an email at Shul. You'll see it on the title card, shul@hmisrael.com. And I'm a lifelong learner. You know, I go through these studies asking the Father to help me to understand, to put this stuff together. No one person has it all figured out. If you ever are following a teacher and he seems to imply that he has it all figured out, run away as fast as you can, because I can promise you, no one person has it all figured out. We're meant to be in community. The Father gives certain things to individuals, and it's meant to come together in community, together. And those giftings and those pieces of knowledge, when they come together, it all comes together. It's like a symphony. And that's what I look forward to, even now, but even more so in the future, when the master conductor, Yahushua himself, conducts the symphony. And so let's behave in a way that is humble and seek knowledge, and try not to immediately reject things, but to open your eyes to things and your ears to things spiritually. Ask the Father, he'll guide you. Baruch Hashem, everyone. Shalom, shalom.